Hello, everyone, and welcome to 2018 and Gaming Mechanics, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics in gaming, how they work, and why we love them. I am Greg, or this week I'm Anonymous Sheep, and with me as ever, far down, far away into Florida, in the warm weather, is my co-host Mark.
Yes, it's sad, but I am sitting here in a t-shirt, and I'm fairly happy about that.
I know, as I am in multiple layers and in a blanket, far in the northern Midwest.
Is it still single digits up there?
No, actually, so it just broke yesterday. It was super cold for about a week, and yesterday got into like the 30s, and I actually didn't wear a coat. It was insane. I wore a long sleeve shirt and a vest.
My goodness.
At like 35. It was 35 and sunny, and that was insane. But anyway, we survived the bomb cyclone, which is absolutely fascinating. Anyway, welcome to 2018, everyone. We have finished our finished games theme.
So today we're going to do an episode on finishing podcast series about finishing.
Yeah.
No, we're not.
We're going to do an episode on starting new podcast series after finishing theories. But no, as we were thinking about how to begin the new year, actually my computer crashed over the past couple weeks, so I'm coming to you live via mobile, so that's fun. But as a side note, the Undertale playthrough that we've been doing on Twitch will probably be delayed a little bit until I can get a new comp up and running. Or we can figure something out to have me watch on mobile. So just wanted to give the heads up there. But also, as we were thinking about things to do for the new year and new beginnings, this has been something we've been batting around for a little bit in terms of it's going to be a new series on the transition in games from 2D to 3D, which was a big deal. In case I can actually remember that.
Yeah,
Mark can too, probably vaguely. It's terrifying that probably most listeners wouldn't. Actually, I don't know. I don't know what our demographics are, but you have to be in your mid to late 20s to be remembering that era before 3D happened. But it was a huge deal.
I guess it didn't occur to me that we might have people listening who hadn't gone through that phase. But you're absolutely right. That's it's a while ago now.
Yeah. So it was a big deal in terms of just gaming as a whole, but specific genres definitely hit differently in different genres. And I think it's an absolutely fascinating thing because it's in terms of trying to find like a really pretty big definitive jump forward or switch in gaming over the life of gaming really is pretty hard. I mean, you could say the online thing was a big, huge deal for sure. That was a fundamental shift. We're on the cusp of VR, I think. That'll eventually probably have a similar effect to 3D, but I think in terms of a huge fundamental difference in the way that people could approach games, 3D was really the big one.
Yeah, it was a massive change, and there were so many unintended consequences, and I think I'm learning this about myself. I love unintended consequences. Like, for me, it's like the toy at the bottom of the cereal box. It's just like, it's so fun to look at things and see like, oh my gosh, World War I had trench warfare because of this specific point of technology that we were at. And like, there's so many little things you can look at where there's a massive impact that nobody expected because of unintended consequences. Yeah.
Well, the funny part there is if you know Mark, then that is true across so many other areas of your life. But no, that's a really good point. And that's in large part I think what we're going to be talking about more so than just it's a lot of the stuff in terms of the 3D 2D switch is pretty simple. But I think it's really more the story of what happened and the way that people began, particularly developers, began utilizing or not utilizing 3D well that I think is super interesting. So, Mark, do you want to give us the go into the history side? I feel like this always happens. Whenever we do like a story-based thing, you tend to give the history.
That's true. I do, and I like history, and I kind of
I know, you're fantastic at it.
I kind of wish I could do the 3D transition a little bit more justice, but we just don't have time. Like, there's
Yeah.
so many firsts in like every genre and on different
Yeah.
systems, but we'll kind of go over some major ones here. So,
Yeah, this is going to be just an intro episode in case that wasn't. We'll hopefully be go by genre into kind of each one more in the future here, but want to give a big overview here.
so the very first game which attempted to use 3D math in a video game was Battlezone. And that was basically a wireframe tank game where, from your perspective, you are not 3D. You just have crosshairs. But you're looking out over this field of other tanks, and the other tanks are rendered in wireframe, and it uses 3D perspective. So it is actually doing the same math that a modern 3D game would be doing, where it's
Right.
having to determine how to draw the lines in such a way that it suggests to the player that the world has depth.
Right.
And just for clarity, when we're talking about 3D here, we're talking about a 3D game space, not a 3D image for your eyes. That's a more recent thing, although I will touch on the Virtual Boy for a second here.
Yep.
So from there, that was an arcade game. It probably did use a decent amount of computing power to make that happen. And then 3D really came, a more 3D experience, we'll say. This happens by degrees. But
Yeah.
a more 3D game comes to... yeah, that's a math joke. Comes to your average player in the form of Wolfenstein 3D, aptly named, or Doom.
I know. Actually, had the. Well, you remember that phase too? Like that. Actually, that was just a thing where people would just throw 3D behind their game name.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like that was. I remember Fury 3D was a. It was a. It was like a ship combat simulator. Look this up.
Fury
At
3D.
home. No, yeah, it's called Fury, and it was bizarre. You were like this it was like this sci-fi. You were like you weren't in space, but you were in like on the ground. It was like this desert planet, and you had like all these enemy fighters, and you had all these weapons you could pick up, and like it was first person. And then the final boss was this. I kid you not, this giant. Like I said, this whole thing has been like picture kind of like Dune-esque like visuals, and then the final boss was this just like skyscraper large king cobra.
Weird.
That shot fireballs out of its mouth. I kid you not. The whole thing had been like this like super 3D. Anyway, sorry. I was just
That's
reminiscing.
all right.
That was one of my favorite games. We had a joystick. God, do you remember joysticks? And that was the
yeah.
only game we could use the joystick with, and it felt so cool to be flying a plane with a joystick as a young on my Acer computer on Windows 95. Anyway, sorry. Total. I just reminded me of. This took me back hard.
There is a lot of memories I have associated with the 3D craze. So yeah, I'm not
seriously.
surprised. But we're not quite there yet. So that
Yep,
was that was the 3D sort of. So the problem with Wolfenstein and Doom is that they're not actually 3D games. It's a little technical to get into on an audio podcast without being able to show you the visuals, but actually the way it's kind of like a slideshow played really fast. Like there isn't any math going on that people would look at and recognize as being 3D perspective transformations. There's no depth calculation other than some very basic quadratic scaling. But like I said, a little technical. Like a really obvious example is if you shoot at an enemy who's above you on the Z axis or the Y axis, depending on how you label your axes, in 3D, your bullets will still hit them in Doom because it doesn't have a sense of, oh, this character is above that character, because it's not actually 3D.
Right. It's the same way that you get like mock like the fact is that even our eyes perceive. We can only perceive 2D images hit our eyes, right? And we perceive the world in 3D because there's all these tricks that our eyes and our brain can do to convince us that we are in a 3D world, and shadings and perspective and the way things line up against each other. That's very, very early what people began doing with basically 2D images to be able to trick you into thinking you were there. But the difference was that, like you said, in a purely virtual sense, in like the simulation of the game world, it was not in fact 3D. So I think it's a really important differentiation to make in terms of when we're talking about 2D versus 3D, because there are think about even right now, like Mortal Kombat, the most recent one, Mortal Kombat X, is in terms of gameplay, it does not take advantage of 3D at all. It's rendered everything in 3D and it's beautiful to look at, but in terms of gameplay, it's still on the rails, still on the basically the XY axis in terms of you can jump and move left and right. which is exactly the same as Mortal Kombat 1 was. So in terms of that, the gameplay hasn't changed. There's other gameplay elements that have been added, but it hasn't utilized three dimensions. Versus, say, a game like we'll get to, like within fighting games, like Soul Calibur, or the Tekken games began using the Z-axis truly in fighting games as well, where
Right.
you actually can utilize the third dimension, and that changes the way you play the game.
Right. And yeah, we'll
So,
talk more about the fighting games a little bit later on too.
right.
And
But anyway, let's keep on going on history.
yeah, so after kind of these faux 3D games like Wolfenstein and Doom, which although it brought a 3D experience to the masses, you didn't have to go to arcade and play Battlezone. From a like mathematical standpoint, it's kind of a step backward, but it made it more
Right.
accessible because you were running these on little home PCs. So
Right.
then we move forward to a game called iRobot, which was by the Atari. That nobody's ever heard of because it
Nope.
didn't do that well. It's one of those like it's cool when a pioneer also becomes popular, but much more likely a pioneer, kind of explores an area a little bit and then fails, and then like
Yeah.
cause like
You
the
tend to know the most
Dreamcast.
popular of the original Pioneer. Like, a true Pioneer, yeah, that's just not the way technology works. Most of the
Right.
time, you don't have this immediate breakthrough, and then it's the best part of that. You iterate, um, and then eventually kind of the magic formula gets hit where it blows up. But
Right. Like, does everybody remember the first touchscreen phone? Yeah, me neither. Like,
no,
it
God,
wasn't
yeah,
it
no.
wasn't an iPhone. I can tell you that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, precisely.
But anyway, so iRobot happened. That was like a true 3D experience. It was an arcade game. I guess it was kind of platformy. It's a little unclear. I've never played the game myself, but it was a couple years after Wolfenstein and Doom. And from there, it was basically only a matter of time until home consoles had the ability to create 3D graphics on their own. And so obviously that happened with the what is that, third gen consoles, PlayStation, the N64. I guess those were the only two home consoles at the time. Microsoft hasn't showed up yet, really.
I think we're four. That'd be Gen 4, I think. I think Gen
Yeah.
7 was the PS3 era.
Yeah, the gens are always
so
tough
go
for
back
me
through.
because I'm a Nintendo fanboy, so I feel like I like to
Yeah.
start at the NES. But like there were other systems before the NES,
Right,
and
yeah. Well, the generations weren't as well defined back then either.
yeah. Anyway, so PlayStation and N64 were the first home consoles to really take advantage of 3D rendering, and that is sort of the moment where everything just kind of went 3D. Like,
Right.
because yeah, arcades were dying out, so although those were the machines that had the ability to do the 3D computations, they weren't really practical, like to target
Right.
as a market because you weren't going to make that much money. The PC world actually got 3D a little bit earlier in the form of Quake in 1996. So just to put that in
Right.
perspective, like this is the time around which Nintendo is making Pokemon on the Game Boy. Like think about how crazy it would
Yeah.
have been to play Quake in a world
Yeah.
where like Donkey Kong 3 is also being released. Like
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah. Or the idea of like having a like yeah. I mean, Pokemon was a huge release, and it was genre defining, and it is 2D sprites at best. Like incredibly. It's very difficult to kind of convey how cool or how big a deal it was to have 3D rendering or talk about like. Do you remember when it became like a phase of like bragging about how many polygons were in the game?
yeah. Which is crazy, right? It's
I
kind of
know,
like
yeah.
bragging about how many pixels. Like imagine if I was like, this
Yeah.
screen has so many pixels, guys. Like you should
Yeah,
totally
yeah.
get it. And like
Yeah.
people talk about inches now. Like the pixels don't even matter. Nobody cares about
Yeah,
pixels. It's
yeah.
like in the millions.
Right, exactly. Yeah, difficult to even comprehend. But yeah, so that is a crazy. Yeah, thinking up about both the time frame, but also what the other contemporary games were at that time is ridiculous. And also just note that the PC Master Race existed pretty much from the beginning of time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the Quake demonstrates that pretty clearly. Like they had much superior experience as far as games back then.
Yes.
And I actually would say that there's a point in which N64, PlayStation, and then probably the next generation after that with the GameCube and the PS2, where
Right.
console hardware actually was it was much more cost effective to play 3D games on those systems than to try to get a computer that could play it. Because of course,
Absolutely.
obviously those computers exist because that's all that consoles are computers that are specialized.
Right.
But it just was way more expensive to try to build your own.
Well, there was also not quite. I mean, the gaming as a market hadn't exploded to the point where there was demand necessary to be producing the types of technology for home computers that were going to be like, they're going to be able to be running heavy graphical computations.
Right.
In the way that it made sense for a specialized system to, throw tons of money into just that. It didn't. That wasn't a thing. Computers were not primarily used for gaming at that point. I don't think they are now, but at the same time, it's a huge shift in the way that people play games and find them. So let's see here. What was...
As far as history goes, like at this point, when the N64 and the PlayStation come out, we kind of abandoned 2D for a bit. Because who wants to make a 2D game for the N64? Right? Like, we just got this cool new technology. It can render things in 3 dimensions, and it's not too laggy, depending on what game you're playing. But, so, like, why would you make a 2D side-scroller for that system? Like, as a designer, what do you want to explore this new space of 3D games, and, like, what can we do?
Quite literally.
And so people just stopped making 2D games. Like, they're just... I can't think of a major 2D title from that era other than on handheld consoles. Like, Pokemon's continued to come out. The Gold and Silver came out during that time.
Right.
But other than handheld... I mean, even on my Game Boy Advance, I remember playing F-Zero, which is a 3D racing game. Racing games are a little bit easier to do in 3D because you don't have a lot of up and down movement, really. Anyway,
it was easy to simulate a 3D environment anyway. That's a really good point. I mean, so yeah, and I feel like this is a truism across a lot of different forms of art, as we were just kind of brainstorming briefly about when a major technological advancement hits a piece, an art form. I mean, some comparable ones I think would be electronic music, the ability to use synths, the ability to put distortion on guitars. The ability to, simulate acoustic sounds or change them in real time. That absolutely just fundamentally changed the way music was played for a while there. Acoustic, music was like the easy one with music would be the Beatles, right? They, in large part, got to define rock and roll due to the fact that and it's so funny if you go back and listen to them, it does not sound too extreme, but it was extremely different and revolutionary for the time. Obviously, in terms of their use of any electronic guitars, people thought it was going to be a detriment to civilization in large part, and corrupting the youth, that sort of thing. I mean, the other one would be, think like 3D movies. When that dropped, everything was coming out in 3D, and it was such a big gimmick. It was kind of a gimmick in large part. And there were certain examples. I mean, as much as I absolutely despise this movie, Jim Cameron's Avatar is remarkable, really, visually, particularly for the time. Obviously. Or Gravity, if you ever saw that in 3D, is just an absolutely stunning experience. But in large part, we see, I think, the thing that you do see is that you see this very, like, think of the 80s, right? Like, was anyone playing acoustic music in the 80s? Like, did we just kind of give up on anything acoustically at that point? And obviously, there's certain differences between these forms. But that being said, there is something that actually gets lost, right? Like, acoustic music was still good. Most movies that were 3D didn't need to be 3D, and it actually took away, I think, from the experience. In the same way, we lost side scrollers. We lost 2D games, and the Metroidvania style. We lost games like the Sonic series. Platformers turned 3D potentially to their detriment in a lot of cases. So it's really interesting that just because there's new technological shift does not mean that it's a good thing necessarily for the art itself. Especially when people kind of jump on the bandwagon as opposed to having a really specific vision for what they want to do with the game or the piece of art. And I think we've seen, like I said, like in the other art forms, just with music and movies, at least in those cases, it come full circle to the point where, obviously acoustic music came back and recognized that that's a good thing in of itself, and not everything needs to be electronic. And similarly with movies, I don't remember the last movie I saw in 3D. It might have been Gravity, actually. back in what, like 2014, 15, where 3D
Yeah.
movies, people don't really care about right now, in large part. So I think that's a really, really interesting thing. And Mark, you even talked about in terms of, so what I've been talking mostly about in terms of the gameplay mechanic as well, as like games kind of lost something. But
Hmm.
even you talked about like even the art, the quality of art actually took a giant dive, ironically.
Yeah, I read an article, I think it was called like The Pixel Trap or something like that, but it was a former 2D artist. He was basically, this was his resignation that he was writing because he was a passionate 2D artist, but he couldn't get over this intuitive attraction that people have to 3D graphics. And he was demonstrating actually how far back art stepped in games when it transitioned from 2D to 3D. Now it's kind of getting back to where it was. Like it's starting to be comparable where the things that are done in 3D are comparable to the things that are done in 2D. And it's a little hard to again explain without visuals, but it
Yep.
showed the animations and just like how more realistic the animations were and how much more life the animations had to them. Whereas when you're rendering these 3D polygons, like especially early on, they were very stiff animations because all you had were shapes that you could rotate and translate. Like when you have individual pixels that you're working on,
Yeah.
it's very easy to add in a little wisp of smoke. It's very easy to
Right.
add in little particle effects around your character and actually have that be part of the character animation as far as the computer is concerned. With
Yeah.
3D, you really can't do that. If you want particles coming off your character, you have to create a particle effect now.
Yeah, like go and look at Castlevania Symphony of the Night, right? Which is kind of held as the exemplar of that series. And the animation, the movement, the effects, the just the ambiance that's achieved in that game is staggering. And then go look at like Metal Gear, the original Metal Gear, or like the first Metal Gear Solid,
Hmm.
and watch one of the cutscenes in game, and it's just horrifying. It's this this like circus clown mirror, like distorted, disturbing view of reality that is not correct, and just like it's and it makes sense, right? You've had decades worth of 2D artists perfecting their craft, and then suddenly 3D hits, everyone's doing it, and no one knows how to do it. So of course there is some just learning curve there, but it is fascinating that just because there was this massive technological leap, that did not mean that art improved. Like I said, not necessarily the gameplay experience, but even the art went down a step considerably for a while there.
Right.
Um,
And now that we've learned, so from as far as art's concerned, we started off just manipulating polygons. That was kind of clunky. We switched to more of a skeletal system instead of keyframing, which keyframing was how they used to do all their 2D stuff. It's still fine for 2D for the most part.
right,
And now we do mocap, which is much more realistic, obviously, because we are actually capturing real people moving around an environment.
right,
And so, in
right,
that way, we've finally gotten the amount of data that makes 3D look good. Like, you have this
right.
weird phenomenon where you need more information because you added a whole other dimension, but people weren't actually able to add in that extra information. Like
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
in 2D, like you've only got 2 dimensions worth of space to worry about animating and to convey to
Right.
the person who's viewing it. In 3D, all that same basically that same amount of information, if you kept it, it would actually look really diluted in 3D
Yeah, totally.
because it's exponentially bigger.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really interesting thing is that we got that I mean the our reach kind of exceeded our grasp in some ways in terms of we opened up that entire new dimension, but didn't actually have the technology to fill it yet. Like we just
Right.
got to the point where we could begin doing it at all, and then realized that we couldn't do it well. And I think that's the way technology works in general. But that's a really fascinating unintended consequence, I guess you could say.
Yeah. That a whole genre kind of falls by the wayside for a little bit. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of when 2D
I
really
mean, I think VR
came
is the
back.
current going to be the current kind of even in gaming going to be the version of that, right? VR technically, I mean, when the the Oculus Rift launched, that was technically years ago, right? That was I was back in I was
Like the
young in
original
college,
one?
I think.
Yeah, that was a while ago.
It was like
Like the
2012 or something.
and
Anyway,
it
the point
is
is, it's that technology technically exists now. VR is there, but it is by far from the and there's all kinds of things that that we could talk about with VR. for why it is different. But that is represents another fundamental difference in the way that people can interact with games. And it's not better than traditional gaming at this point. Period.
Yeah.
And that is interesting in that potentially just because of the cost requirement along with it, why it hasn't become as mainstream. But like I said, we were talking about how 3D happened and it hit, and everyone jumped on 3D and it was super successful, but the games probably weren't necessarily as good as they were before. In this case, people haven't jumped on VR, despite like the fact that it's new and the games probably still aren't good as they would be here. That has actually stopped people this time from adopting it.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Like it's almost like these games are good enough looking that we don't have to jump to VR right away. We can wait for it to be decent. As Greg mentioned, I live in Orlando, Florida, and I was at Disney Springs, which is kind of like their free poor man's Disney area, and it's not really. It's just a bunch of shops.
I didn't even know it was.
But it is a thing, and I went there, and it's not actually for poor people, as I'm going to describe it, because I was at a little booth so I was with a couple friends, and they showed me this new Star Wars exhibit they have, where you go into this building and they fit you with a VR headset, and then you proceed through this sort of maze that they've created. And the VR, it's not really AR, because typically when you think of AR, you've got a translucent screen, and then the screen paints things on top of what you're seeing. But this was actually the headset takes in your surroundings and renders them in your viewfinder as Star Wars. So it was a Star Wars themed thing. And so you would look at yourself and you'd see a stormtrooper, you'd look at your buddies, you'd see stormtroopers, and the walls would have all sorts of circuits and spaceship sort of things on them. Mm-hmm. And you would proceed through this adventure. And I think it's pretty cool. Like, I thought it was I need to try it out sometime. Maybe we'll do an episode on my experience with that. But it kind of struck me that, like, okay, yeah, the VR world is still moving. Like, things are still happening in that space. It's developing, and it's slowly reaching a point where I think it will start to be used a bit more mainstream than it currently is. Currently, it's cost prohibitive, and people aren't really quite sure how to give you a space to move around in 3D without giving you, like, a warehouse. You know, like, where do you go?
That is a major problem. And that one's going to be real hard to get over. Outside of basically utilizing a booth or something. Well, again would be cost prohibitive.
It's funny. I remember when I was probably 9 or 10, and I wanted to be a game designer. So my mind was just in these places, but I was trying to think of how to solve this problem. I remember very specifically laying awake at night thinking, like, can I make like a omnidirectional treadmill that will always move you back toward the center? I think that they have those now, actually, but they're not practical. God.
Yeah, well, that would be very difficult. There'd be a host of engineering problems with that.
Yes, there would. I was not ready to solve those at 10, but you know.
Well, that's probably for the best. Otherwise, I don't know. You might be ruling the world right now or something.
Probably. Anyway, so let's jump on.
So let's go to games. Let's actually get to games.
Yeah, worth jumping into platformers.
Yeah, jumping into platformers.
That's probably what our episode will be called, on platformers. Anyway,
we just settled.
Sorry about that.
So platformers are a fascinating one. I think they're one of the purest examples of the transition from 3D to 2D in terms of the gameplay mechanic side, not necessarily the art, because platformers are literally about just space and your movement through space.
Right.
And so I think appropriately the opening up of an entire new dimension, which sounds kind of sci-fi-y, but is pretty accurate, really changed those games. And fascinatingly enough, again, I'm trying to decide, even as we've been talking about this and thinking about this, how much, when you adapt a new piece of technology, there is going to be some level of just growing pains across the board. But at the same time, that's normal. That shouldn't be surprising to anyone that, like, the initial attempts at this were not perfect. But at the same time, there is a level, like, let's talk about one of my absolute favorite series, because just nostalgia. But I grew up as a PlayStation kid. So Crash Bandicoot was I remember just being out of my mind excited when we'd go over to my older brother's friend's house, who had a PlayStation 1. I got to play the original Crash, and I wouldn't get to play, I'd just sit and watch. But just being the combination of the art and the music, and the bizarre sense of humor, and the way that Crash gets eviscerated when he dies, comically, was just so cool to me. Now, the original Crash and a lot of these original 3D platformers were notoriously punishing, like really freaking hard. And that was in large part because we kind of zeroed in on what you would do was you wouldn't the 3D realm was so poorly perspective becomes the issue, right? When you move from 2D to 3D, suddenly you need to be able to give your players a really good sense of depth perception and the way that they're going to be able to interact with that. And what ended up happening was basically the worker they couldn't do that in large part. They didn't have enough either acumen or technology to be able to give you a great sense of where you were in the world. And that becomes super frustrating when you make a jump, can't tell where you are, you think you're in the right place, and then you fall through what appears to be the floor and die. And so the solve for that, in large part, at least that Mark and I could figure out, was basically giving a sense of where you were depth-wise via your shadow.
Right.
Or not even shadow, but like the black
A
dot
black dot.
under your character when you
Yeah.
jumped. That would tell you exactly where you were in the world. Which, if you're paying attention, actually isn't quite 3D still.
No, yeah.
you're
It's
still only controlling a two-dimensional object in space.
yeah, exactly.
You go right, left, forward, back, which is hilarious.
You're basically navigating a dot through like a discontinuous 2D space. And like
Yeah.
you just have to
Yeah.
jump at the right times and make sure your dot doesn't land on any of the discontinuities and like
Exactly.
that's the game. And like
Right.
it's really weird like when you boil it down like that
Yeah.
you actually like you totally could do a deconstruction of 3D platformers as a 2D game
All the way
with
down
a
to
dot.
that. Yeah.
Like
yeah.
like that would be I would actually play that game. I think it would be really funny.
Yeah, that would kill in 2018 right now. If we're
I
not
know,
playing
right?
it.
Because that's kind of where we're
I'd be
at
like-
as like a in terms of
That's-
the state of the art right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, that
Just
was
entirely pulling it back.
it's weird that like it is like just shadowy enough to sort of be passable as a shadow. Like it was definitely done at a time where they could not have done a real perspective shadows, and frankly,
Right.
it wouldn't have been as helpful. Like the little
Yeah.
black dot under your character is like a perfect solution
Well,
because
exactly, and
it's not distracting and it tells you exactly where you're going to land.
right. Well, it's entirely like you said. Those games are just based around precision, right? There's no sense of speed necessarily. There's no need for like spacing as well. I guess spacing in terms of your jumps and stuff. But there's the whole game, right? When we talk about like what is the game is being able to move your character through this area. That's it.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily puzzle solving. It's not necessarily dialogue or anything like that. And so you do need to be remarkably precise because that's the whole point. And there's really nothing more precise than a small black circle.
Right.
In terms of like bottom lines for representing good lord, representation of something, a tiny dot is pretty much the best we can do.
Yeah, in terms of precision.
Yeah, pretty much.
My
So,
goodness. So
so that's funny. I mean, Crash was the one that came to mind because that was the one I played and grew up on. Obviously, that did get better even over time of the PlayStation's life cycle. I can't really quite think of what I would say. Probably environmental detail, the precision of controlling Crash too, even with the controller, got a lot better over the years between Crash 1 and Crash 3. I think the level of I do remember pretty vividly. Crash 1 was more zoomed in. You were closer to Crash. And even the angle was like slightly lower than the later ones where you could see more of the world basically, and it's more zoomed out. And it was able to be rendered, I think, more completely, just as developers got a better sense of what they could do.
it's funny, like
But Crash certainly wasn't alone in that.
in terms of platformers, like Crash is still very on rails, right? Like you're going through a small track the entire time.
Yeah, basically.
And Mario
And
64. I was
Go
gonna
ahead.
jump into Mario 64,
Yeah,
which
go for it. Go for
is a much broader world. Like you really can go in all directions, and it's a little bit more puzzle solvy than Crash was. Like it doesn't just get to the end of the level; it's collect the stars.
Right.
But if you think about Mario 64, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more later, there aren't, and I haven't played it extensively, so somebody might send me some hate mail, but I don't think there are too many like jumps where like you missed the jump and now you die. Like
Right.
in Crash, that was like all over the place. There were so many places where you
Yeah.
could miss a jump and die. In Mario
Right.
64, it's more forgiving. Like you'll miss and like maybe you'll have to climb back up to the top of the tower again or something like that.
Yeah.
But you don't just straight up like, oh, you just lost a life.
Well, because there's really no way to do that in 2D without you just literally having to walk all the way back. Like, there's no way for that to be interesting in 2D. You just had to eliminate and start over. If you like fell into a lower world and had to walk backwards and then go up an elevator and start again, that wouldn't be interesting. Right? Like there's no point. So they just take a life and give you a life mechanic. 3D in a full 3D world, it's actually interesting to have to climb back up or find the place that you were or interact with the world again in such a way that you get to the point where you can get back to the point where you want it to be. That's the whole point of like a 3D world.
Right.
So that's a fantastic point. I'd never thought of that actually. Was that I'm sure there were bottomless chasms and whatnot, but it was not in the, like even with Crash, right, where you miss a jump, you die, and then you restart. You're right. In these more kind of open precursors, maybe to sandboxy games, you're punished still with backwards progress, but then the getting back to the point you were is the game. Like that's the fun of having to like platform again and get back there. And Mario 64 was obviously so good at just that, again, nailing that key dynamic. It felt fun to jump around. It felt fun to move. It wasn't a chore. It was like the reason you were playing the game.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want to spend too long on platformers. Do you want to talk a little bit about Sonic Adventure as another game that's, I would say, pretty successfully did to 3D, but let's see what you have to say about it.
So a lot of people have different thoughts on that. Sonic Adventure is also a very special game to me because that was the very, very first game I actually had in my home. My first console was the Dreamcast in 1999, and the game that we got with it Christmas morning was Sonic Adventure. So the very first time I ever booted up my own gaming system was the Sega Dreamcast with Sonic Adventure. So I know that game. That being said, Sonic was, and this is also interesting, hark back to a time when it was Sega Nintendo more so than. Well, I guess Sony had been. Dreamcast was kind of the end of Sega in that regard. But Sonic and Mario were kind of the two big guys. And obviously Mario made the transition to Mario 64 in flying colors. That is still considered one of the top games of all time. Sonic Adventure was interesting. So if Mario was more about the jumping and the getting to the end of the level, Sonic was very much about the speed. There were less really precise jumps you had to do, and more kind of learn a track almost with the original 2D Sonic games, right? As there was still obviously the really precise jumps you had to do, but it was more so there'd be a lot of times you'd be moving so fast you actually weren't really controlling, just holding over, right? And it would be this wonderful sense of speed and movement and super creative and dynamic levels. And so that sounds very like it would make tons of sense to be able to transfer over to 3D. And in a lot of ways it did. It ran into a lot of similar problems. And as a kid, I didn't really realize this. I actually went back. I still have a Dreamcast at my parents' house. I brought it back to my place last year, maybe Christmas time, and was replaying some of my old original Dreamcast games. I still have my original copy of Sonic Adventure. No, I don't. I think I just bought a new one. But anyway, point is, and was playing it, and there are points that are absolutely infuriating. Like I said, that sense of speed that the Sonic games were so good at, Sonic Adventure tried to replicate for sure. And it's at its best when it is basically doing that on some of the portions that are 3D, where you get to run around, it's hard to like spiral, like DNA, like helix spirals, and run around those, doing things that you couldn't do in 2D are staggering and really fun. The problem became when you would have to like transitioning between set pieces, kind of. When you'd have to make a jump from like a helix into like another like loop-de-loop, and then into like a sideways wall. That's when you ran into problems because again, 3D was not. It was very hard to figure out where exactly Sonic was and where he needed to be in order to hit the next point. There's a notoriously annoying level called the Sky Deck, which is played around. It kept on switching between 2D and 3D, where you would play kind of like a side scroller, and then you'd have to like hit something and then rotate, and then go like straight, basically again. That was stupidly annoying because it kept on switching and it didn't figure it out. So Sonic Adventure was, I think, this really, I remember, and still is, this really fun experience went at its best. Unfortunately, it fell into, I think, a lot of the same traps of not being able to tell exactly what there were a lot of disappointing and annoying. Oh, the other huge thing with Sonic Adventure, sorry, I'll end on this rant soon, was, oh my god, I can't believe I haven't talked about this yet, camera placement. We did not figure out how to control a camera
Yeah.
in a 3D world until like the PS2. I remember it was a huge deal when the right joystick controlled the camera and the left joystick controlled the character. That was like a mind-numbingly cool thing that Jack and Daxter did. I don't think Jack was the first one to do it, but Sonic, you had one joystick, right? So the whole game, oh my god, yeah, having the camera change with environment and environmental cues was infuriating because if you like missed a point or like got to the point where the camera's supposed to change and like backtracked for a split second and then it didn't, it would switch back and forth really quick. Was just, like I said, again, with games that had to be that precise, with angles and speed, like Sonic had to. That was an absolute cluster.
Oh yeah.
In some cases,
It's funny that like
so
this.
yeah, that was
The solution to that eventually ended up being a concession. Like, we
yep.
can't make cameras smart enough. Here, you control it. Like,
Yep.
that's basically where we got to as a as a community of gamers and game designers. Like, they
Yep.
they just gave it back to the players because it was too ridiculous to try to
Yep.
figure
Yep.
out every possible corner case.
Which is interesting too for those. You'd think that like in some level, with a game that had to be that specifically designed about just motion, they would be able to optimize. Be like, hey, this is the best way to see the character in this case. I could understand for like adventure games or like stealth games that being able to utilize the camera yourself would make more sense because there's so many. But in like an on the rails, just get to the end of the track
Yeah.
game like Sonic was, you think that that would actually be one of the more optimal environments to be able to have the developers be like, no, this is all the best ways to be able to do this stage, and that it was not the case. Just didn't happen that way.
All right, well, we're going to jump into just a couple of other genres quickly here, because there's so many. Obviously, there's a lot of gaming genres, but we're going to go over some of the major ones. So I would say like fighting. You mentioned Soul Calibur in fighting games, and the idea of being able to like circle your opponent is a very uniquely 3D thing, and so dodging by strafing left or right to avoid an attack is it's very significant, right? If you think about fighting strategy in 2D, if you're going to avoid an opponent and avoid their attack not by guarding but just by creating distance, then you've also created a gap. Like now you have a gap to close. In 3D, you can strafe left and avoid an attack by dodging, but you haven't created a gap. In fact, you probably found an opening because they're committed to the wrong direction, and now you can come at them from the side. And so in terms of fighting strategy, that's a huge change.
Yep. It also built I could again wax eloquent on fighting games because I actually really love them too. Know a lot about them, but the other thing. So that's a fantastic point. One, two. The other thing is then you have to blocking changes entirely too. In a 2D game, you basically breaking through a block is you can hit high, low, medium, overhead, those sort of things, and different types of blocks do different types of things. With a fully 3D fighting game, suddenly you either after blocking up a wall entirely, or B, make blocking be directional, and be able to have that be a separate thing that you can direct as the player, where you don't just hold the block button and then one other key. You have to actually be able to direct the block.
Right.
The other interesting about Soul Calibur, which was that it was also kind of the first weapons-based combat game, which I think is interesting. That coincided with 3D as well, where you have Super 3, like, because I don't know, and this might be oversimplifying, but in general, right, you think about just like punches and kicks. Those kind of like they go forward or they're kind of coming at a certain angle, but it's not they're pretty straightforward in terms of the moves you do. With weapons, there's all kinds of arcs and jabs and slashes, and it works a lot better in 3D than in 2D. And in the ways that hitboxes are connecting, or that the animation would follow through, X, Y, or Z, take away you will. And so Soul Calibur, I think, combined both. Like I said, they nailed the ability to strafe basically. And have movement, as well as then fitting weapons into that and having kind of new dynamic, and that all came together into what's in large part considered one of the best fighting games of all time. Actually, the original Soul Calibur, which is fascinating. That's also mentioning another Dreamcast exclusive, and it's also funny because Soul Calibur kind of died out. I don't really know if the series even still going. It's probably because it was Sega, But yeah, so that was a huge deal. And like I said, look at like Marvel vs. Capcom or Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, and those still are on the 2D rails, and that works great.
The latest Soul Calibur release was 2014, so it was.
So, all right, well.
I think it's probably still going, but I haven't seen any major innovations in the series. We'll say that.
Yeah, it's not quite holding up the same level of space that it once had. So that was just kind of a brief picture on fighting games that we could, like I said, Tekken did put that in, and Tekken is also very, kind of one of the big three games around Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and Tekken, I would say, but yeah, Tekken's its own game in a lot of ways too. I could talk about that at more length in the fighting games. Tekken's very much an in-between and a very, very different style of game than... To be good at Tekken, you have to be very, very different than you are at Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, right. In terms of just the way that those games work.
And if this feels...
Or even think about, like, Super Smash, right? Like, that's still... The transition, I guess that started as 3D, it never was 2D. But those games would work as 2D sprites entirely. There's nothing 3D about the gameplay there.
No, you're totally right. Yeah, I actually hadn't thought of that. In fact, there's a game called Rivals of Aether, which is a 2D Smash clone. It's very good, and there's
cool.
you don't notice the missing dimension at all, really. And just in case this feels very dense to people, we will be going back and doing episodes on these genres. So if you feel like we're fire hosing you a little bit, don't worry, we'll come back around and we'll expand on this a little bit.
You want to talk about RPGs briefly?
Yeah, so the clear series to look at for RPGs is Final Fantasy, because they were making games in 2D and then they continued making games in 3D. And obviously there are other RPGs that have done that, but it's one of the more famous ones. So Final Fantasy VI was entirely 2D, overworld, battle screens, everything else. And Final Fantasy VII was entirely 3D. Overworld, battle screens, again, everything other than the menu was 3D, and it was very low polygon, and it was pretty rough as far as trying to actually understand what the characters looked like. Some of the animations are kind of pretty, actually. All like basically anything that just could be recorded once and then put into the game looks pretty good. Right. In fact, there are some cutscenes in Final Fantasy VII that are like darn good. Really? Like the CG stuff that isn't like rendered, it doesn't have to be. It's not in-game graphics really. It's like a cutscene, and so it's funny to you get a glimpse at real-time 3D rendering versus offline 3D rendering, and how much of a gap there was at that time. There was a huge gap. Yeah, seriously. One was like, oh, my cloud is 7 polygons, and then the other one is like, oh my gosh, like this character looks pretty good. Anyway,
I remember that. I remember that phase. The difference between rendered and in-game stuff, and I mean you can still kind of see it a little bit, but good lord, back then it was insane.
Deal. Like I remember looking at a breakdown. I was a huge Final Fantasy VII nerd for a while, and looking at the breakdown of how much space on the discs is dedicated to those cutscenes, it's insane. Really? Like it is. Yeah. I think it's some massive percentage, possibly 30 or 40%. Yeah. And it's like a 2-disc game, and like there's not that much cutscene. Like it's several minutes maybe. And it's a massive part of what goes on that disc.
Sure.
So
that's really interesting. I mean, I think of actually back to RTSs and the original Westwood RDSs with Red Alert and Command and Conquer, and how those had actually full live action cutscenes, but there are also kind of in betweens where they would have 3D. Those games are obviously in 2D. And then when you had a 3D rendering of like what was supposed to be in the game world, it was so cool. And you'd like jump back to the game world, and it was like, oh, like we're back to like this is what it should be. I remember dreaming as a kid about when like being able to play cutscenes, basically, like when games would look like cutscenes.
Yeah.
And that I think in large, I mean, certainly, that's been surpassed. But even like, good lord, what's I haven't played this, but like there've been shots of Horizon Zero Dawn that I was convinced had to be pre-rendered and are in fact in-game engine that's being interacted with. I think that's the only game I've looked at and I've been like, oh my god, like I can't imagine. I would like show like 10-year-old Greg this shot and I would have absolutely just, I don't know, had a seizure or something.
Well, you brought up a really good you brought up a really good point while we were talking about Final Fantasy VII, which is, and similar to what you brought up during Smash, there's not initially anything 3D about the game. Like,
Yeah.
Other than the 3D...
For 7. Yeah.
Like, I guess you could kind of talk about the overworld, but it's not 3D, it's just a different perspective 2D. Like,
Yep.
whereas the battles
Yep.
are really more side 2D.
In fact, it's even isn't the background even 2D, and then your sprite is 3D?
No, it's a full
okay.
3D.
It's full 3D. Okay.
It's full 3D on the overworld. In
Yeah.
battles, I think it basically is just a 2D
Yeah.
background with you lined up as in a typical RPG.
Right.
And like again, the animations, all the cool graphics that like they do in 3D they make use of 3D space. A lot of the animations do.
No, totally.
But in terms of like the gameplay, you really aren't ever moving in more than 2 dimensions at once. It's not like a platformer where you're moving left, right, front, back, and then you need to jump. Like it's only ever you're concerned about 2 dimensions.
I mean, yeah, 6 and 7 play pretty. I mean, outside of the differences in terms of like the materia system and all that jazz, but like 6 and 7 play pretty similarly actually in a lot of ways. There's not a huge fundamental jump there.
No, not at all. I mean, you're still spending a lot of times in menus, trying to configure your characters and then trying to pick what moves to do, and then
Right.
your interaction with the game is through text, basically. And there are a couple points in Final Fantasy VII where you do need to like go find things in 3D space, and like sometimes that can be a little frustrating because like you're like, I'm right in front of him, why can't I talk to him? And it's like, oh, I'm like, my perspective is wrong, so I like actually need to be a little bit further to talk to them or whatever. And I would say that actually those parts of the game are some of the more frustrating moments because it feels a little bit harder to navigate this 3D world than it needs to be. But most of the game is you interact through the menus.
Where was it really Final Fantasy like 10 where that finally became? Was that probably the big jump where it was fully a 3D like overworld and actually a full? Because I remember when Final Fantasy 10 came out, but mostly just because I remember the graphics for that day and age were absolutely jaw dropping. That was a early PS2 game.
What you were referencing earlier,
I think it was also a big part was that it was the big huge transition for the Final Fantasy series.
Yeah, it was actually. I didn't realize this, but what you were referencing earlier about the 2D backgrounds, you're right. So the overworld proper, where you're literally kind of able to use the high wind and fly around to different islands. Spoiler for anybody who hasn't played the game. That is 3D truly. But if you're ever not in that overworld, so if you're in a town, if you're in a dungeon, if you're in a forest, those are actually pre-rendered painted 2D backgrounds. And so, and you navigate those like they're 3D, but they aren't. There's no 3D rendering going on there. So, Final Fantasy X did actually have all the levels, all the dungeons, everything was truly 3D graphics, which was a big deal.
Yeah, I remember that. All right, well, let's just end on the whole adventure Metroidvania genre.
Yeah. So this
kind of, because I think this is a really cool one.
I do. Yeah, and we've got about 5 minutes here, so we got a little time.
Okay.
So adventure games like Ocarina of Time and Metroidvania games, obviously like Metroid or Castlevania,
that's an easy one.
Right. They aren't that different in 2D. Like, if you think about, I hope nobody freaks out about this, but just bear with me for a second. If you think about, like, Link going through a dungeon, solving puzzles, trying to find his way to the end, going through different rooms, bombing random walls, depending on what game you're playing. It's similar to what you're doing in a Metroid game. The major difference to the player is the perspective, right? You're top-down for a Legend of Zelda game, and your side for Metroids and Castlevania. But actually, what you're doing is very similar. You just don't. There's not as much jumping. Basically, I mean, Zelda games I remember were weird to me for a long time because I had primarily played platformers, and in Zelda games you can't jump. I'm just
there's no jump.
Why? How do I play a game where I can't jump?
Yeah, what's the point?
Right. And I have an appreciation for those games now, but that's like the major
Yeah,
difference. Like in terms of how you would design a level and what the player is doing and what they're thinking about, it's not
yeah,
that different.
yeah. The whole, I mean, yeah, the goals, the game itself, the genre is very similar. It's just you're very right. The only difference is literally the perspective you're looking at it from. And it's really interesting
Whereas,
to me that before 3D, when you could combine those two things, we did have to have two kind of separate subgenres of like adventure games looking down and then adventure games from the side.
right.
Um,
And nobody called those Metroidvanias back then, but they were. It would be. I think it would be harder to at that time look at those two games and be like, these are two completely different genres.
yeah,
Whereas now
yeah,
we
I agree with that.
actually can say that because we can see the way that the lineages played out. And once 3D hit games like Legend of Zelda, there was no going back really.
Yeah.
With the exception of Four Swords, which was kind of an interesting little side thing.
Mm.
Zelda took very quickly to 3D and created Ocarina of Time, and I think that's one of the reasons why that game was so noteworthy was because you kind of could see this genre come into its own. Like
Yeah.
it was a big deal because it was sort of like, oh my gosh, this is what Zelda games should be like.
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah.
for Metroid games, arguably it became more of a first-person shooter. Like it kind of lost what made it a Metroidvania.
Yeah, they had to reinvent it in large part. It wasn't really, I mean, so Metroid Prime is quite beloved but that's again more of a first person action game. Than certainly the old Metroid kind of style of game. I mean, you had suddenly your first person, you have the fact that you can, change into the morph ball and that whole sequence being super different. In terms of the way that comes across more as like a weird like monkey ball kind of platformer, you know. So that was super, super, and like I said, it was very beloved, but it was very much a different thing, as opposed to like you said, Zelda really felt like an expansion on like what Zelda was and what it should be, and just with just an added thing. And I think interestingly enough, Castlevania didn't really make that jump. Actually, I know there have been 3D Castlevania games. I don't really know of any of them, and they certainly did not survive and age well. So
Yeah.
they didn't really figure that out, and I
I
think
would,
that's
I'd say
really
the
noteworthy that adventure games. Well, what had to happen was we had to come back to 2D basically and have kind of this Metroidvania renaissance with, Hollow Knight and
Splunky was a
yeah,
Metroidvania.
Spelunky, yeah.
Um, yeah, I would say the spiritual successors to games like Castlevania would be something more like, maybe this is just in theme, now that I think about it, but like games like Deus Ex or Bloodborne, in terms of
Oh,
carry
yeah,
the themes forward, but they
yeah, sure.
really it's not a Castlevania game. Like
Yeah, I know.
it still plays quite different, and it's hard to think of a Castlevania in 3D. Like it just there's so much important
Yeah, it
about
didn't really work. I mean,
yeah
that kind of became like Devil May Cry or something like that,
yeah Devil May
where
Cry
it
would be
was
another
kind of
one.
this gothic combat setting. You don't know this game. That was a early PS. That was a early PlayStation 2 series. I remember when that came out. I remember it was very cool. And again, your young minds are very simple, but it was a apparently I also didn't like watching any anime, so apparently I was just totally. But you could play with swords and guns. Your character had swords and guns,
Huh,
and I was like,
it's a big deal.
"Whoa, that's cool." It was also too scary. So, anyway, but yeah, so adventure game, and just again without gushing too much on Ocarina of Time, Ocarina also really defined very Beatles-esque in terms of their ability to, I mean, like targeting, 3D targeting, and how combat works in 3 dimensions, like was defined by Ocarina basically. That game figured it out, and then since then, everyone's just kind of been iterating on that to the point where you can kind of play almost any 3D action adventure game and be like, is this sounds in a similar way to if you like listen to almost any modern like rock or pop, you can listen to them and be like, oh yeah, it kind of sounds like the Beatles to an
Right.
extent, right? Like this is semi Beatles-esque. It's the same thing with Ocarina. That's why that game is so beloved. It's interesting. If it goes back, it's still, I don't know, man. I don't, it holds up all right. I don't think it holds up great, honestly, in terms of gameplay mechanics.
And I think
But
that that's typical for games or for anything that really is is copied a lot, right? Like Citizen Kane, famous
Yeah,
film,
sure. Yeah.
or the Beatles are famous music. Like, again, I'm gonna get so much
Lord of
hate
the
now after this
Rings.
episode. But like, if you listen to the Beatles or if you watch Citizen Kane now, I don't know, I'm not like super impressed, but that's because
Yeah, you're gonna get hate mail
it's
now.
it's well, that's fine. I would love hate mail.
Yeah.
uh, that's because it's been used so much. Like
Yeah.
it's been those ideas are well worn, and they were
And
used.
iterated upon and discovered, and yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and in some
No, I
ways
agree. I agree.
improved. Like Citizen Kane, there's better cinematography in a modern movie than in Citizen Kane, but it's not as
Yeah.
groundbreaking. So like, of course,
Yeah.
it's a fantastic movie in terms of
Right.
the things that they thought of. Because
Yeah.
thinking of something the first time is like way harder than iterating on an existing idea.
Oh yeah.
And
Yep. No,
so
I
just.
mean,
Just so that it doesn't sound like we're just, criticizing 3D, I do want to take a second, give a shout out. 3D did enable new genres of games.
yeah.
And there are a lot of these. One that just came to mind was Super Monkey Ball. You can't play that game in 2D. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
That's a good
you
point.
you have
That's a
to
great
have 3 dimensions, and there are
Yeah.
other simulation type games like System Shock and later BioShock,
Sure.
and those sorts of games. You're trying to simulate a realistic environment, and so you can't really do that in 2D. It just doesn't really translate. And so there are lots of cool new things to do in 3D that you couldn't do in 2D. But we just wanted to make the point that things were lost, or at least radically changed, by this shift, sometimes for the worse.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, is that there's some level of when there's a huge technological advancement, people want to jump on it because it is new. And that is not doesn't it creates more opportunities basically and gives you a whole new area to play in. It does not necessarily mean that it's all going to be superior. It's not like this linear jump forward.
Right.
It's a new dimension.
Oh my gosh.
No, it's not just, hey, everything's really better now. That's just not true.
Right.
And like we've alluded to before, currently you see a lot of kind of the indie game surge, a lot of really unreal 2D games. Some of the best ones have been like Cuphead, being a classically good example
Fantastic.
of a very very old style game.
Ori and
that
the Blind
is,
Forest.
just staggeringly good. What was that?
Ori and the Blind Forest is a fantastic
Yeah,
2D game. I mean, it's
Yep.
it's not strictly 2D, but it is basically, it's like 2.5D. We'll talk about that. But yeah, that's
Yeah.
a fantastic game. Well, the new Mario games, like a lot of platforms have shifted back to 2D. So I love when a technology becomes a tool. Like if somebody makes a 3D movie in 10 years, I'd probably go watch it because it's a very deliberate choice to use a technology that isn't,
Yeah.
you're not just using it because people love to use it. You're using it
Yep.
because you want to send a very specific message to your audience. And I think when a technology is used in that way, it results in a much better experience for the people viewing it instead of just doing it because it's cool.
Yeah, and in the same exact way, right? Like, if just making a 2D game because it's retro now, it doesn't mean it's going to be a good game or it's going to really mean anything.
Right.
Like it doesn't. It's not about which one's better. It's about that really fundamental artistic vision that a creator has for what they want to be doing, and the best way to express that. And like I said, in Cuphead's case, that was with hand-drawn 2D art and a completely on the rails 2D shoot 'em up boss fighter, and it turned out to be a masterpiece.
Yeah.
Equally so, you can go out and play Journey, which is a intensely 3D game, and could not be done in 2D in the same way, and is a complete masterpiece in its own right. So, I think I really like that differentiation mark. Technology is a tool, and really having to be secondary to kind of the artist's vision for what they want to be doing.
Right.
And we will be exploring that more as we move forward with these. Like I said, we really blew through a lot of these genres, so we'll go back and be a little bit more precise with each one.
Right. Yes, join us next time. We're going to be doing this for a few weeks here, 2D Goes 3D. If you have other suggestions of things you'd like for us to cover, don't hesitate to send us an email. You can reach me at mark@gamingmechanics.net or Greg at gamingmechanics.net, and that will go to each of us respectively. And I hope that you are all having a fantastic 2018. We'll see you next time. If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter at Gaming Mechanics or Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.